Hello and welcome. I'm Bill McNeese, President of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology. Thanks to all for joining us today for a two-part gathering. First, the presentation of the Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture, and second, the virtual presentation of the WLM Laureate of the History of Anesthesia Medal to Dr. Christine Ball. The virtual presentation will immediately follow the Wright Lecture. This session is one of a series of abstracts, panels, lectures, and other events related to the history of anesthesiology and anesthesia that will occur over the course of Anesthesiology 2020. We hope that you will be able to join us for many of them. At this point in the program, I would like to have Susan Vassallo join us to introduce the 2020 Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecturer. Dr. Vassallo has served the WLM for many years in many roles, including service as president of the WLM from 2011 to 2015. She continues to be involved in the work of several committees, including service as chair of the Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture Committee. Now, I had said that I would like to have Susan Vassallo join us, but we weren't able to overcome some technical hurdles involved in that process. So instead, I will be presenting some remarks that Dr. Vassallo prepared. The Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture is sponsored annually by the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology and honors the lecture's namesake. Dr. Wright was a pioneer in American anesthesiology and was committed to enhancing the stature of anesthesiology as a clinical science and as an advanced medical specialty. Shown on the left of this image, along with Paul Meyer Wood, the namesake of the WLM on the right, Dr. Wright was a founding member of the WLM Board of Trustees and later served as its president emeritus. In 1973, the New York State Society of Anesthesiologists endowed this lectureship to honor Dr. Wright. The 2020 Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecturer is Dr. Christine Ball, AM, MB, BS, MD, FANZCA. An Australian, Dr. Ball is a member of the Department of Anesthesia and Perioperative Medicine at the Alfred Hospital. She is an adjunct clinical associate professor at Monash University and honorary curator of the Geoffrey K. Museum of Anesthetic History, all in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Ball is also the 2020 Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology Laureate of the History of Anesthesia, but more on that later. Her lecture is titled Dark Matter, Stories from the Shadows. The mental health of medical practitioners is currently of concern to all physicians. Bullying, long hours, increased expectations of patients, and the rapid pace of change are all listed as contributors to the mental health problems. Now, we know these problems are not new, but we know little about their consequences in the past. Dr. Ball's presentation will return us to the 19th century and investigate the darker historical stories of important people who suffered intense emotional hardship with devastating consequences. Our history celebrates great achievements, great men, and occasionally great women. But if we're going to paint a realistic history of the past, it should also tell the other stories, the darker stories, the stories of difficult issues, and the complex emotions that make us human. In this lecture, Dr. Ball will highlight the mental and emotional challenges experienced by physicians in 19th century Britain, at the time when anesthesia was first introduced into clinical medicine and the era of modern surgery began.
Thank you. It's a very great honour to be invited to deliver the Lewis H. Wright Lecture for 2020. I'd like to thank Susan Vassallo, Bill McNeese, and the Board of Trustees of the Wood Library Museum for giving me this opportunity. This has been a very challenging year for everyone. We had all hoped to be in Washington, but instead I'm delivering this lecture from Melbourne, my hometown, currently in a different time zone, a different climate, and a strange utopian world where we're in lockdown at the moment. As you can imagine, that's created a number of technical difficulties with presenting this lecture, and I'd like to thank everyone at Anesthesiology 2020, including the film crew and technical production people who've made this possible. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, I have no financial interest to declare, and the images in this slide production are in the public domain unless I've otherwise stated. Lewis H. Wright is an important person in the world of anesthesiology. Not only was he an anesthesiologist, but he also worked for E.R. Squibb & Sons, so he crossed disciplines and obviously had a career-long interest in pharmaceuticals. He also served in the US Navy, and he had leadership positions in the US Navy, in anesthesiology, and in the Wood Library Museum. And he was an important advocate for the ASA to join the World Federation of Societies of Anesthesiologists. But possibly his most important achievement was in persisting with the suggestion that curare had a place in anesthesia, and ultimately in convincing Griffith and Johnson to use it in clinical trials, and thus transforming anesthesia forever. In short, I think Lewis H. Wright was bold, innovative, and imaginative, and he would appreciate a lecture being given in his name from a city so far away from where the meeting is being held. When I wrote the abstract for this talk, it was 2019. I was aware that the mental health of medical professionals was an important contemporary issue, and I thought it needed some historical context. But I was not to know that there was a pandemic brewing, one which would challenge the mental health of so many in our profession. So I sincerely hope that nothing in this presentation today is distressing to anybody, and I send my best wishes to everyone who has suffered with their mental health over the last few months. In 2001, Richard Smith wrote an editorial in the British Medical Journal. It was entitled, "Why are doctors so unhappy?" He listed many things that I'm sure you would recognise: long working hours, the rapid pace of change, poor leadership, negative press, increasing legal problems, and coping with inevitable mistakes. As you can imagine, this editorial caused an outpouring of correspondence. Most of it was in support of what he had said, and many detailed their own experiences. But there were others inevitably who wrote saying that young doctors were not as resilient as those in the past, and that they needed to have more realistic expectations of the profession. Central to Smith's argument was that we have a bogus contract with patients currently. That currently the patient believes that modern medicine can solve all of the problems that they have, that doctors know everything, and that the reason that they're paid so much is that they can solve all the patient's problems. Doctors, of course, know differently. They know that modern medicine is limited, that we can't solve every patient's problem. But they're potentially worried about disappointing their patient, and so they don't share this with the patient. What Smith proposed was a new contract, one where death, sickness, and pain are part of life, one where doctors are open about their limitations, and where patients understand that we're all in this together, and that medicine has limited powers and is risky. To me as a historian, this resembled what I imagine life was like in Victorian England, when doctors could do very little except sit with their patients like the man in this very famous painting and wonder whether they would still be alive in the morning. Which then leads to the question of, how did doctors cope in the 19th century? What was the mental health of medical practitioners like at that time? Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. In many ways, the 19th century resembles the current times. Although we feel overwhelmed with information now, we're suddenly bombarded with information from all sorts of social media, We can search for information on so many search engines. Pharmaceuticals change all the time, and the perioperative journey for the patient changes weekly as new medications come into their lives. And then they introduce electronic medical records and a pandemic. But when we look at the 19th century, there was a great deal of change then too. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptics, and antiseptic surgery suddenly was introduced, changing surgery and surgical expectations forever. Vaccinations also came along, and an increased understanding of infectious diseases. There were complete changes in public health and total redesigns of hospitals and the nursing profession. And then, of course, there was anesthesia, which totally transformed medicine, probably more than anything else has in the history of surgery. So doctors in the 19th century had to cope with all this rapid change as well. If we want to look at how doctors coped with their mental health in the 19th century, it's difficult to know where to start. But for a start, the problem is our own historiography. Medical historians, surgical, anaesthetic, and physicians all celebrate greatness. We celebrate great men, sometimes great women. We celebrate great achievements, great accomplishments, and even when things go wrong, like deaths from chloroform, what we celebrate is how these things were overcome. We don't look for the problems that happened along the way. Mental health, by its very nature, is invisible, and so it's difficult to find, especially historically. And then there are other problems, one of which is illustrated by the case of Thomas Morton, a young surgeon at University College Hospital, whose story is the first of one I want to tell you today. Thomas Morton was a young surgeon at University College Hospital at the time when anaesthesia was introduced. He was a very promising surgeon, and he had a great career ahead of him. He worked with two very famous men. First was Robert Liston, who held the chair of clinical surgery and was, of course, the person who introduced ether anaesthesia into major surgery in Britain. The other chair at University College Hospital at the time was held by Samuel Cooper, the chair of systematic surgery, which was more about anatomy and dissection. And Thomas Morton, as well as helping him with his teaching and anatomy dissections, was also his son-in-law. So Thomas Morton expected that he would have a brilliant career. He expected to rise up through the ranks of University College Hospital. But suddenly everything went wrong at University College Hospital when Robert Liston died. He died suddenly after a very short illness due to a rapidly expanding thoracic aortic aneurysm. He was in the prime of his life, only 53 years old, and Thomas Morton was probably one of 400 mourners from the hospital who accompanied his coffin up the hill to Highgate Cemetery. If you make an appointment, you can actually visit his coffin, which is just rather disconcertingly sitting on a shelf in the mausoleum there. It was expected that Robert Liston's position would be advertised, but for some reason it was not. The senior members of the staff on the board appointed James Syme, the leading surgeon in Scotland. And while James Syme obviously had all the credentials required for the job, everyone was outraged that the job was not advertised and given to somebody in England, especially someone from University College Hospital. There was an outpouring of correspondence to the Lancet. Many of these letters were very critical of the board at the hospital, and many of these letters mentioned Thomas Morton as someone who had been overlooked. In the process, Samuel Cooper also had some changes to his work schedule and was no longer allowed to get Thomas Morton to assist him with his work. That and many other things about James Syme's appointment led to Samuel Cooper resigning in a fury. And when he resigned, he wrote a letter to the Lancet outlining all the reasons for his resignation. This triggered even more correspondence from various people, none of whom were prepared to identify themselves, but who all signed with very dramatic signatures, like two of the injured and insulted, Veritas, and my favourite, a dying gladiator. But all of them were outraged at the situation at University College Hospital. Obviously, the environment was becoming very toxic. Things really broke down when there was a prize-giving ceremony at University College Hospital in May. Some of the leading physicians at the hospital were awarding prizes and were supposed to be giving speeches, but in the event, they were booed off the stage and unable to be heard. As a result, James Syme was so upset that he went home, wrote a letter of resignation, and returned to his position in Scotland. The hospital was then in complete disarray. It had no leadership at all and no support from any of its staff. The job was advertised this time, and Thomas Morton applied for it, but the job was given to Moncrieff Arnott, a man who incidentally only lasted in that position for 6 months because things were getting so difficult at the hospital. But this was the final straw for Thomas Morton. His brain had been unravelling under all this stress. A few days after this, he took an overdose of cyanide and his body was found by his servants in his house. An inquest was quickly ordered, and a very brief post-mortem was performed by his friends and colleagues. All they did was examine the stomach contents and establish that he had died as a result of an overdose of cyanide. The coroner for this inquest was Thomas Wackley, who was also the editor of The Lancet, and he was not satisfied with this verdict. He wanted a fuller post-mortem. So he ordered John Erickson, who was ultimately to become the Professor of Surgery at University College Hospital, to perform a more full post-mortem. He particularly wanted an examination of the brain. And when this post-mortem was presented, John Erickson was unable to find anything particularly wrong with the brain except that it was engorged, consistent with cyanide poisoning. But Thomas Wackley would not let the issue rest. He called witness after witness to the witness box to attest to the fact that Thomas Morton's mind had been unravelling. And in the end, he instructed the jury to bring a verdict that the patient had died of an overdose of prussic acid while in an unsound state of mind. This was really important because the verdict then was not one of suicide. Suicide was illegal, and although there had been a change of law in the 1820s, so Thomas Morton could be buried on consecrated ground, if a diagnosis of suicide had been made, all of his possessions would have been forfeit and his widow and children would have been left penniless. And so Thomas Wackley, in being very kind to Thomas Morton and his family, had made life very difficult for the historian. We have to find people like Thomas Morton by accident, as I did. But there's no doubt that this man, confronted with a very toxic work environment, bullying and unfavourable press, unravelled and ultimately took his own life. That's just a legal judgment on suicide. If we want to look more closely at the mental health of doctors in our own profession, the best place to me seems to look at the case of chloroform in the 19th century. Now, obviously, I've never used chloroform, but there's no doubt it must have been a much better drug than ether. Ether was safe and chloroform was not, and yet the moment chloroform started to be used, despite deaths from chloroform, people used it with gay abandon, certainly in Britain. The first death was, of course, the death of Hannah Greener, a young girl just having a toenail removed. She died in January of 1848, just after chloroform became available. But the verdict about her death was that it was not due to the chloroform because she died so quickly after its administration. And there were a few other deaths in the first few months. One I think is worth looking at is the case of Thomas Badger, a young solicitor who presented to James Robinson, the dentist in Gower Street, for extraction of 6 teeth. Now, James Robinson was a very experienced anaesthetist. He was the person who had first experimented with ether in London, who had first persuaded Robert Liston to use it. And for the first 6 weeks of ether usage in London, He basically gave up his dental practice to just administer ether. He eventually returned to his dental practice, making full use of the fact that he had all this experience with ether. But before that, he wrote the first textbook on ether anesthesia, which is basically a series of case reports. But once chloroform became available, he switched immediately over to chloroform and gave it freely in his dental surgery over the next few months. By the time he saw Mr. Badger in June of 1848, he claimed to have given at least 3,000 chloroform anaesthetics, which means at least 100 a week. So he has to have been using it freely, because he can't have been doing that many dental extractions without it. And yet apparently, he said later, that he told the patient chloroform was an unnecessary risk for this procedure. Let's just imagine the scene. Mr. Badger was seated in the chair. The housemaid administered chloroform to the patient. Within 3 minutes of beginning the inhalation, the patient was dead. There was no sophisticated resuscitation techniques or equipment available. The things you see on this poster here, the Sylvester method, the Marshall Hall, they were still yet to come. There was no assistance available. James Robinson summoned his footman, who ran out into the street, and out in the street he managed to find 2 doctors passing by, which was fortuitous, but I guess not surprising, because Gower Street is very close to the hospital. So 2 doctors came in to help James Robinson. They laid the patient on the floor. They dashed cold water in his face. They opened his veins. And that was about all they could do to attempt to resuscitate him. So it's not surprising then that James Robinson, at that time, what was going through his head was, I told this patient he shouldn't have had chloroform. It was too risky. But you do have to wonder if that's what actually happened, and whether his brain actually rearranged events to help him cope with this terribly traumatic event. We all know that's something that happens when terrible things happen in operating theatres. He would have been helped, of course, to deal with this by the post-mortem. At the post-mortem, 27-year-old Walter Badger was found to have a very enlarged heart and a greatly enlarged liver. And so Wackley, at the inquest, was happy to say that death was not due to chloroform. And then Jon Snow also supported this diagnosis. Jon Snow, of course, by then was the leading anaesthetist in Britain, and he looked closely at this death and concluded it was not due to chloroform. Jon Snow made a very close analysis of the first 50 deaths under chloroform anaesthesia. He firmly believed that they could be prevented by using dilute chloroform, and that if less than 4% chloroform was given, death would not happen. He published the first 50 deaths under chloroform anaesthesia in his book, which was published just a few weeks after his death in 1858. If we look at those deaths, it's interesting to find that the case of Mr. Badger is not under the 50 cases of death from chloroform, but under the alleged fatal cases. In that section of the book, you'll also find the 3 deaths that Jon Snow was personally involved in. So although he did have deaths from chloroform anaesthesia, he did not attribute them to chloroform, and he sought some safety in his scientific belief that administering 4% chloroform or less would protect you. And presumably his colleague, Mr. Potter, also sought some solace in that science. But who was Mr. Potter? Mr. Potter occurs frequently in the literature. He's to be found in the proceedings of the report of the committee investigating deaths under chloroform anaesthesia. And his name appears in their conclusions before Clover, who I know contributed greatly to the report. So it would seem that he was a very busy and influential anaesthetist. His name appears everywhere, but I had never been able to find anything about him. So there are many problems when you go looking for somebody whose actual initial is H and his surname is Potter. You put that in any search engine, all you'll find today is wizards and witchcraft. It doesn't help if you put H. Potter chloroform or H. Potter anaesthesia. All you'll find then is YouTube videos of small children waking up from anaesthetics, believing they've been accepted to Hogwarts school. Parents, it seems, can be unusually cruel to their children when they're waking up from anaesthesia. So I spent a long time looking for H. Potter, finally discovering that his first name was Henry. And I have eventually found him, and I'm not surprised to find that his story is a sad one. He wrote only 2 articles that I've discovered. Both of them were brief, really. Both of them were really letters. Both of them were in the immediate months after Jon Snow's death. And both of them encourage people to use Jon Snow's inhaler, as it will prevent deaths under chloroform anaesthesia. So it would seem for a while at least that Henry Potter had expected he might take over Jon Snow's practice, or at least assume the mantle of responsibility for promoting his beliefs. And at the time, he also said that his joint experience with Snow was the greatest of any men in England. So clearly this was somebody who had a great deal of experience and who really should be more prominent in our history. He didn't end up taking over Jon Snow's practice for various reasons, which I don't have time to go into today. Most of it drifted over to Joseph Clover. So what happened to Henry Potter? Well, apparently he had another death from chloroform in 1868. Up to that time, he had continued to give anaesthetics at St George's and at the dental hospital, and presumably continued with his busy anaesthetic practice. But then he had another death, and that death really tipped him over. Without Jon Snow to support him, he lost all faith in his anaesthetic equipment and his abilities. He instantly resigned all his appointments and was replaced by Francis Woodhouse Brain, who at that stage was planning a surgical career and hadn't even decided to take up a career in anaesthesia, although he did have some experience. Henry Potter even transferred the lease on his London house to Brain, and then he disappeared. I have no idea what happened to him. I don't know his date of birth. I don't know his date of death. I don't know how he died. All I know is that this was a man who was prominent in our profession, who has disappeared from our history because he was unable to cope with a death on the operating table. Interestingly, he didn't write up this death, and it came at a time when there was a letter to the Lancet, or an editorial, saying that there had been a number of unreported chloroform deaths and that they were encouraging people to write them up. They also acknowledged that they sympathise with the pain people feel when those events happen. And that's one of the only references I can find in the literature to an acknowledgement of the mental trauma of this sort of event. One place that we can also look for the effects of these sort of things is in the private papers of some of the anaesthetists of the 19th century. Now, I've personally had a lot of access to Joseph Clover's papers and have looked very hard to see what effect these events had on him. He had 4 deaths under anaesthesia during his career. The first was not an anaesthetic death. It was due to an inhalation of a tooth. And it is a measure of the fact that how seriously everyone took this and how much it affected everyone that the dentist, Alfred Coleman, wrote a letter to Clover saying how sorry he was about what had happened and inquiring after his feelings, and saying that no one there would think that he bore any responsibility for it. It's interesting, this letter, I think. These were people who would see each other every day, so to put this in writing means that they were all supporting each other and taking these events seriously, acknowledging the effect they were having. The next death he had was a year later, and it was probably due to anaesthesia. He had an extraordinary track record at that stage. He'd had over 14,000 anaesthetics, given it over 14,000 anaesthetics without a death. And this one obviously upset him greatly. He did write an account of it, but for some reason it was never published. And he was unable to get a post-mortem, which left him very frustrated because he could not decide whether the death was due to the patient's pre-existing illness or due to the chloroform. He had used his chloroform apparatus at that stage, which was very carefully designed to deliver 4% or less of chloroform. He had another death the following year, which was not due to his chloroform apparatus, but due to an experimental piece of equipment he was using, which he called the blowing apparatus. This, in fact, was an early insufflation piece of equipment that he had designed and never marketed. It involved a foot bellows blowing air over a chloroform vaporizer, and there's only one illustration I've been able to find in his notes on the left of the screen here. He never marketed it, and as far as I can see, he never used this device again because of this death under anaesthesia. Dudley Buxton subsequently developed a piece of equipment which was very similar, which blew air with a foot bellows over a Junkers apparatus. He's often credited with creating this device, but I'm sure that Buxton modelled it on Clover's original equipment. Buxton himself never claimed priority for this invention. And then Clover had one more death under anaesthesia. This was a really unfortunate one. He'd been experimenting with ethidine dichloride and he was really happy with it. And he had arranged to give a lecture at University College Hospital. Just the week before the lecture, when he had over 1,000 successful cases, he had a death under anaesthesia, and he had to hastily modify his talk. It's a measure of how distressing this was that he must have written to his friend William Cadge in Norfolk, and Cadge wrote back to him just a day or so before the lecture, saying he realised how distressed that he must be by these events, but the people would not blame him because they knew what an excellent anaesthetist he was. And so there's no doubt that in the past people found these events to be immensely distressing and sought support from their colleagues. But death was not the only issue with chloroform. Anaesthesia created a real issue with consent. So prior to anaesthesia, patients, of course, still had to consent. They had to consent to being held down. They had to consent even to being brought back to the operating table if they were to run away and escape during an operation. And while anaesthesia was obviously a good thing, it removed the patient's oversight of the surgeon. And a lot of patients found that quite disturbing. If they were unconscious, they couldn't check, for instance, that the surgeon would remove the correct leg or the correct eye. And many people got around this by having their relatives attend their operations. But that did not usually happen with dental operations. And it was a dental operation which led to this issue with chloroform and consent. The case involved was known as the case of Absalom versus Statham. The dentist was John Lee Statham, who was an important figure in the world of dentistry. His brother founded the Northern Hospital, and he was the dentist to that hospital, and a very experienced and well-regarded dentist. The patient was Mrs. Absalom, a 32-year-old divorcee who needed 6 teeth extracting, and she went to see John Lee Statham in his rooms and told him that she couldn't have chloroform anaesthesia because it had nearly killed her before. Nevertheless, she did turn up to the hospital for the appointment where she was to have her teeth extracted under chloroform anaesthesia. She even underwent preoperative assessment with a stethoscope, and then she claimed someone crept up from behind her and administered chloroform against her will. The next thing she knew, she was waking up with a lot of blood in her mouth, 6 teeth missing, excruciating pain. And over the next few months, Mrs. Absalom suffered immensely. She developed excruciating pain in her mouth, which never went away. She was admitted to a number of hospitals, mostly with a diagnosis of hysteria. Eventually, she decided to sue Statham. She sued for 2 things. One, that she'd been given chloroform without consent, and secondly, that she'd had 6 teeth removed without consent, and that these 2 things had caused her prolonged pain and suffering. The lawsuit caused an immense deal of distress to not only Statham but the whole profession, because everybody felt threatened by this case. When the first case was heard, it was apparent that Statham had been overly generous to the patient. He'd been so concerned about her situation that he'd provided her with some money, he'd driven her to medical appointments, he'd paid for some of her hospital admissions. And all of these things, of course, went against him in the court case because it was thought that this meant he was complicit. And his friends and colleagues held a number of fundraising meetings, and on this list you'll see a number of famous names in anesthesia, surgery and dentistry. They all gave money to help him in his defence. And eventually the first case fell over because the jury couldn't reach a verdict, and it was another year before another court case was held. Eventually, at the second court case, with more money raised by his friends, the court found in favour of Statham. But this court case had taken its toll on Statham. Once the case was over, despite the support of all his friends and winning the lawsuit, he sold up everything and with his wife travelled to Brisbane in Queensland, Australia, an extraordinary destination to pick at that time. Brisbane is a big city now, but then it was just a small town of 10,000 people and about as far away from England as you could be. Over the next 10 years, he didn't practice dentistry. He wrote a lot of poetry for the local paper and started to drink an enormous amount of alcohol. And then almost 10 years after he got there, Statham was found drowned in the river at the end of his own wharf. No one knew whether he had intentionally thrown himself into the river or been drunk and fallen in. But it's apparent that this court case led to this man's life completely unravelling. However he died, there is no doubt that he was immensely traumatised by this court case. It was 20 years before the Medical Defence Association was first formed, so this controversy about paying for medical defence continued for many years after this case. There's just one more story I want to tell you today, another person who I think has gone missing from our history, but is supremely important, and that's Charles Fox, the dentist. When nitrous oxide was first brought to England, it was the dentists who first embraced it. And Charles Fox, together with Joseph Clover, worked immensely hard over the next few months to work out how best to manufacture and deliver nitrous oxide. Charles Fox purchased a still and set it up in his dental surgery, and he and Clover ran a pipe through under the skirting board so that Clover could administer anaesthesia to Fox's patients without the patients having to see all the complicated apparatus involved. Together they worked on the manufacturing techniques and conducted a lot of experiments on animals, and they were instrumental in persuading the local manufacturers to work hard to develop compressed gas in cylinders, something that was at that stage not available. So they worked for months perfecting these techniques, and there's no doubt there were other dentists as well working on this, but Clover and Fox did the bulk of the work. And then in August, there was a meeting of the British Medical Association in Oxford. Fox gave a presentation about the manufacture of nitrous oxide. Clover then gave a lecture about how best to administer nitrous oxide, and then he concluded his lecture by anaesthetising Fox on the stage for the audience. Then he woke him up, and Fox continued with the discussion about nitrous oxide. So not only were they instrumental in working out how to make it, and how to best administer it, and how to prepare nitrous oxide in cylinders, but they also taught many other people how to do it. And Fox also has a very important place in the world of dentistry. He was one of the founding dentists involved in the dental hospital. He was the founding editor of the British Journal of Dental Science and held that position for many, many years. But things went wrong with Charles Fox's life. He'd borrowed quite a lot of money from Clover in their early lives, and over many years he paid interest religiously every month. And then suddenly something went wrong towards the end of the 1870s. Reportedly he had asthma, but I don't think it was asthma that led him to leave his wife and family. He did leave his wife and family, and he moved to Canada with his dental nurse's sister, a young woman called Agnes. And he stopped paying money back to Clover. He was unable to divorce his wife because she was a Catholic, but he subsequently married Agnes when his wife died. And then over the next few years, he and Agnes both became addicted to chloroform. Reportedly, Agnes suffered from neuralgia and took chloroform for that. And Fox took it for his asthma. And then sadly, both Agnes and his wife died within months of each other, reportedly of accidental chloroform overdose. I have no idea whether that was in fact the case, but I do know that Charles Fox was an important person in our specialty. He has an important part in our historiography and that of the dental profession, and yet he is largely forgotten because his life came to a rather tragic and difficult end. All I've been able to do today is bring you anecdotal stories. I've got no data, I've got no statistics. What I was hoping to do with this talk today is start a conversation. There are people missing from our history. Their stories are hidden in the shadows. They're dark and difficult stories, and they're really hard to find. But I believe we need to go looking for them. I believe it's time to put these people back in our history and to stop the emphasis on greatness, great men, great women, great achievements, and provide a more holistic picture of our history. If we as historians are going to have a part to play in the contemporary discussion about mental health of the medical profession, then I believe we need to provide a more realistic picture of the past. Once again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to deliver this lecture, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks to Dr. Ball for a memorable Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture. The Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology Laureate on the History of Anesthesia is an honor bestowed every 4 years to an individual, regardless of nationality, who has made seminal contributions to the history of anesthesia. On the screen are images of the 7 laureates from 1996 through 2016. I'll note there were 2 awards presented in 2000. Nominees are sought internationally, and the recipient is selected by a committee of 9 individuals with international representation. Dr. Douglas Bacon, the 2012 laureate, chaired the laureate committee for the 2020 award. Following the conclusion of the 2019 Wright Lecture, Dr. Christine Ball was announced as the 2020 laureate. It had been our plan to present the laureate medal to her following the conclusion of her 2020 Wright Lecture. Well, while we cannot physically present the physical award right now, we do recognize and honor Dr. Christine Ball as the 2020 Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology laureate in the history of anesthesia, and we will see that she does receive the physical medal. Congratulations, Dr. Ball.
It was an enormous honour to be nominated to be the laureate of the Wood Library Museum. An even greater honour to find that I had won the award. There are so many people I would like to thank, and obviously I can't thank everybody, but there are a few who must be mentioned. Firstly, of course, the Board of Trustees of the Wood Library Museum. I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity to represent you for the next 4 years, and I hope that I will live up to your expectations. All the staff of the Wood Library Museum have been immensely helpful to me over many decades. 3 people in particular I would like to name. Firstly, obviously Patrick Sim, who is sadly no longer with us. And equally sadly, I never actually met Patrick, but I did talk with him on many occasions, and he was immensely helpful to me and very supportive of all that I tried to do. Judith Robbins, of course, answers every query within microseconds. Even though I live on the other side of the world in a different time zone, Judith always seems to respond rapidly and with everything that I need, and I'm immensely grateful to her. And Karen Beeterman, who of course retired last year, has become a very great friend, and it was a very great pleasure to have her in Australia a few years ago and be able to return some of the friendship and hospitality she has shown me over many years. The Wood Library Museum has an extraordinary honorary curator in George Browse, and I am incredibly grateful to him for all he has done for me. He has always believed in me. He has supported me in every way. I would love to be able to emulate George with his attention to detail. He has a brilliant sense of how perfect something should be, and I will never be able to achieve that. But I'm eternally grateful that I have him as a friend and someone I can call on for that sort of assistance. My friend Wolf Stratling drove right across Wales to have lunch with me and persuade me to be nominated for this award. Without him doing that, I don't think I would be here today. He also drove to London at the beginning of this year to have lunch with me, and I'm so grateful that I was able to see so many friends when I was in London before the world went slightly mad. Our own ASA, the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, has given me a platform for writing for over 30 years. They've supported history with the cover notes in all that time, and I'm immensely grateful to everyone on the editorial staff and a succession of presidents of the ASA and editors. I'd like to particularly mention Jeanette Thirlwell, who was so patient in the early days, teaching me to write, and the current editor, John Loadsman, who always makes me laugh. And then also particularly Michael Cooper, who's the editor of our history supplement. We've collaborated on many projects, and I'm immensely grateful to him for all his support and friendship. I recently recorded an oral history with Michael Cooper for the college, which you'll be able to view on the website if you go to the college's oral history website. He's been a really important contributor to international anaesthesia, particularly in Papua New Guinea, hence this photo. The College of Anaesthetists, of course, has also supported me in everything that I have done and entrusted me with the care of its precious treasures. I'm immensely grateful to a succession of presidents and councils who have supported the Geoffrey K Museum and me in all that I have been doing. And particularly I'd like to thank our current curator, Monica Cronin, who has transformed our museum into such a professional organisation and who teaches me something every single day. I'm very grateful for her support and her friendship. But none of this would have happened without Rod Gressthorpe, and it's to him I give my greatest thanks. Rod lit the flame. Rod was the person who first brought me into the college and showed me the Geoffrey K Museum. He's the one who fostered my interest in history and gave me all the opportunities that have led me on this journey. I'm so grateful to him for everything that I have become. And the other person who has been an important part of shaping my journey is Professor Paul Miles, the chair of our department here at the Alfred Hospital where I work. Paul is one of the most significant researchers in the world of anesthesiology, and yet he still finds time to support others in their work. He has been my friend since we were at university, many, many decades ago, and he supported me in my clinical work, my academic work, and certainly in my history. And I'm immensely grateful to him. The other gentleman in this photograph is, of course, a statue of William Pugh, who gave the first anaesthetic in Tasmania in 1847. There are many historians who've also enriched my life and I would like to thank, but I want to give particular mention to these three. To Peter Featherston, who collaborates with me now on the cover notes and has been a wonderful friend and support to me, and to Doug Bacon and David Wilkinson for being my friends and my mentors and my advisors. And finally, a thanks to my family, to Jonathan and my children, Jackie and Charlie, who have never known a life without a world full of history books and their mother buried in the study. Thank you once again for this tremendous honour, and I really hope that I will do justice to the award. Thank you.
In closing, thanks for joining us today for the Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture and for the virtual bestowing of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology Laureate of the History of Anesthesia Medal to Dr. Christine Ball. The Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology is the source of all things anesthesia and anesthesiology history. We encourage you to visit our website regularly at www.woodlibrarymuseum.com. Even as our in-person exhibits have been closed, our virtual exhibits have remained open 24/7. We continue to update and expand virtually with new images and content. We post anesthesia history to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram on a regular basis, and we would be happy to add you to our email list to send you our quarterly update. Just let us know. This has been one of a number of history gatherings at Anesthesiology 2020. Check the WLM website for more information on those gatherings. And until we meet again, I wish you good health and a good day.